Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be an eensy bit different, but not that different. It doesn't really fall into that broad dark content category that I usually do on my channel, but it's something that I found really interesting and hopefully you guys will agree. So we live in an era where information is more easily accessible than it's ever been before. I can pull out a device that fits in my pocket, but can tell me almost anything I need to know within literal seconds. But with this information superhighway comes several different caveats, namely misinformation and frauds. Pretty much anyone can put anything out on the internet that they like, and people will believe it. But this isn't really unique to the information age. Hoaxes and fraud have existed for pretty much as long as humans have. Let's explore a hoax that was only perpetrated in the last 100 years or so, but has been called one of the biggest in archaeology. Let's talk about the Piltdown Man. So to understand the Piltdown Man, let's set the stage a little bit. You've probably heard of Charles Darwin, who formulated the theory of evolution back in the 1830s. The theory became public knowledge in 1859 when his now famous book, The Origin of Species, was published. According to Britannica, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had three main components: that variation occurred randomly among members of a species, that an individual's traits could be inherited by progeny, and that the struggle for existence would allow only those with favorable traits to survive. We all know about evolution today, but it made huge news back then because it was completely new. It was controversial back then, just like it is today. But the theory made perfect sense to scientists because if it were true, it would fill in a lot of gaps in their knowledge. So they became determined to find evidence or proof of it. And the competition was fierce. I never saw it explicitly stated, but it seems like scientists in countries without major discoveries were kind of looked down on. And Britain was one of those countries. Enter Charles Dawson. I know his name sounds a lot like Charles Darwin's, but Darwin doesn't really have much else to do with the rest of this story, so it shouldn't be too confusing. Charles Dawson was a lawyer and amateur archaeologist and geologist. He'd always had an interest in the natural world and had made quite a few archaeological finds, which earned him the nickname the Wizard of Sussex. Among his finds were a Roman statuette, stone axe, and the teeth of a mammal named Plagiaulex Dawsoni, named after him, of course, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, I'm sorry. At the age of 21, he was elected a Fellow of the Geological Society. This was pretty rare for someone so young, and it was considered an honor. In the early 1900s, Dawson was the steward at Barkham Manor in Sussex in the UK. So when I was researching this, I got a little bit confused. There is a Barkham Manor in Berkshire, but that's almost 100 miles away. The Barkham Manor we're talking about is close to Piltdown, a small settlement in Sussex. It shows up on Google Maps as Barkham Manor Cottage, but I assume they're the same, or at least in similar locations. On the grounds of Barkham Manor in Sussex was a gravel pit that was thought to have dated back to the Ice Age. At some point between 1907 and 1910, a laborer found skull fragments in the pit and passed them on to Dawson, who he knew had an interest in archaeology. Dawson went to the gravel pit to do some digging of his own and found a few more fragments. In February 1912, he wrote a letter to his friend Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, who was the head of the geology department at the Natural History Museum, telling him about the remains. Later that year, Dawson went to Smith Woodward's office and dumped 5 brown bone fragments on the table. He said they were from a shallow pit in Piltdown and he believed belonged to an ancestor of modern man. So just a quick note before we continue, most sources I looked into said Smith Woodward worked at the Natural History Museum, others said the British Museum. What is now the Natural History Museum in London actually used to be part of the British Museum. It split off on its own in 1963 and was renamed the Natural History Museum in 1992. In this video, I'm mostly going to be referring to it as the Natural History Museum, but if you research this on your own, it might say the British Museum, so I just wanted to clear that up. Dawson and Smith Woodward continued to dig at the site whenever they could, which was usually weekends and holidays. They found even more fossils there, including stone tools, fossilized animals, and a jaw that still had teeth in it. Smith Woodward tried to reconstruct the human fragments into a skull. What he came up with had the brain of a modern man, but jaws and teeth closer to an ape. He thought this might be the so-called missing link between apes and man. Dawson and Smith Woodward publicly announced their findings to the Geological Society of London on December 18, 1912. The new specimen was named Eoanthropus dawsoni, after Charles Dawson, of course. It's more commonly known as the Piltdown Man or Dawn Man. There have been different estimates on the age range of this specimen that range from 500,000 years to over 2 million years. Piltdown Man was thought at the time to be proof of not only evolution, but that man had originated in Europe. As you can imagine, this was huge for British scientists, especially Charles Dawson. After the announcement, Smith Woodward and Dawson continued to dig at the site. Over the next 3 years, they found even more fossils, including teeth, nasal bones, and more stone tools. But not everyone was convinced of Piltdown Man's legitimacy. In 1913, an anatomist named David Watterson said Piltdown Man's jaw was emphatically not that of a human. Several other scientists agreed over the next few years. Most of them thought the jaw came from an ape and the skull came from a modern human. Some of them claimed a chimpanzee jaw could be broken and easily reformed to look like the jaw of Piltdown Man. But these early skeptics were usually just dismissed or ignored. In 1915, Dawson found another pit about 3 kilometers away from the original site. In this new pit, he found skull and teeth fragments that he dubbed Piltdown 2. After this second discovery, as well as the Natural History Museum vouching for him, most people seem to accept this find as legitimate. The start of World War I in 1914 and Charles Dawson's death in 1916 caused digging at the site to slowly grind to a halt. After Dawson's death, the museum was presented with the Piltdown 2 fragments. In 1938, a memorial was built for Dawson at the site of Piltdown Man's discovery. After Dawson's death, Smith Woodward opened up several more pits in the area and did some digging, but never really found anything of huge significance. In fact, after Dawson's death, not much else of significance was found at the original pit at all, and Dawson was the only person who'd even known where the second pit was. Smith Woodward retired in 1923 and continued to dig at the site until the early 1930s. He died in 1944. In 1948, his book, The Earliest Englishmen, was published posthumously. You can still find this entire book online, and I will leave a link below to anyone who wants to look into it further. In the decades following the discovery of Piltdown Man, other fossils of early human ancestors were discovered around the world, but they all looked a bit different from the supposed missing link. According to History.com, none of them showed the large brain and ape-like jaw of Piltdown Man. Instead, they suggested that jaws and teeth became human-like before a large brain evolved. In the 1940s, new technology was developed for fossil dating, and people started to question Piltdown Man's legitimacy again. In 1949, Dr. Kenneth Oakley began in-depth analyses of the fossils. Dr. Oakley and his team fluorine dated the bones. This test, of course, measures the amount of fluorine in the bones. The more that's there, the longer they've been buried and the older they are. Piltdown Man's remains didn't have that much fluorine in them, and they couldn't have been there as long as previously thought. Dr. Oakley concluded that these bones that were thought to have been over 1 million years old were actually closer to 500 years old. They also did chemical analyses of and x-rays on the bones. As it turned out, the skull was a human skull, but the jaw was from an orangutan. The teeth were also unusually flat. If they had been worn down naturally, such as by grinding food, they shouldn't have been that flat. The teeth had been filed down, and the bones stained with iron and manganese to make them look older. There's conflicting information about exactly when these findings were exposed. Some sources said it was as early as 1952, others said it was as late as July 1954. But one thing was clear: the Piltdown Man, once thought to be proof of evolution, was a total fraud. Obviously, this finding was huge. Scientists who had believed that Piltdown Man was a legitimate specimen were basically back to square one. It must have been so frustrating to have something they accepted as fact completely turned on its head. But one question remained: who was responsible for perpetrating this hoax? One theory is that a man named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was responsible. Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest, philosopher, and paleontologist who worked with Dawson at the gravel pit site. People were suspicious of him from pretty early on. As the theory goes, he created the skull as a practical joke that he didn't realize would go as far as it did. Another theory is that a man named Martin A.C. Hinton was behind the hoax. At the time all this was happening, Hinton worked at the Natural History Museum under Smith Woodward. In the 1970s, years after Hinton's death, a trunk was found at the museum that he'd used while working there. It contained bone samples along with a recipe that was the same one used to make the Piltdown bones look older. According to King's College professor Brian Gardiner, Hinton was the only person who would know how to create a skull like that of Piltdown Man. But why would Hinton do this? His name has never even come up before this. Like I said earlier, Smith Woodward was Hinton's boss, and at some point in the early 1900s, he gave him a contract work to do. Hinton wanted payments in increments as he completed portions of the work, but Smith Woodward refused to pay him at all until the job was completely done. People who think Hinton did it said he was angry at his boss and created the skull to get back at him. The next theory is probably my favorite. It concerns someone we've actually talked about before on this channel, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle was known for works like The Lost World, as well as the creation of one of the most famous fictional detectives, Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle lived pretty close to Piltdown and even gave Charles Dawson a ride to the excavation site once, though I'm not sure just how well they knew each other. Some people think he even hid a clue in The Lost World, which was published in 1912, the same year as the Piltdown findings. Admittedly, I haven't read The Lost World. It's been on my TBR list for literal years, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. Anyway, there's apparently a passage in the book about bones being as easy to fake as a photograph. But why would Conan Doyle do something like this? He was a spiritualist, and he considered spreading spiritualism to be one of his primary goals. According to Britannica, spiritualism is the religion and psychic research subject based upon the belief that spirits of the departed continue to exist in the hereafter and can be contacted by those still living. If you watch my video on the mummy's curse, you'll know that Conan Doyle was one of the first people to propose the existence of said curse. So he obviously had some pretty closely held beliefs, and scientists love to mock them. Some people believe Conan Doyle created the Piltdown hoax to get back at British scientists for mocking his spiritual beliefs. But the most prominent theory, and one that, as we'll see in a minute, is almost certainly true, is that the perpetrator of the hoax was Charles Dawson himself. A lot of people also believe Sir Arthur Smith Woodward was involved, while others believe he's completely in the dark. But Dawson has been the most prominent suspect from the start, and there's tons of evidence to back this up. Not only did Dawson keep the bones for a while before turning them over to the museum, but he was the only person who even knew the location of the second site. His neighbors also reported seeing him staining bones in an office. Most people believe he planted the bones in the gravel pit, then dug them up later. Dawson would also have known exactly what to do. He wasn't a professional scientist, but he certainly rubbed elbows with a lot of them. He knew that scientists thought that a fossil of early man, were it to be found, would have an ape-like jaw but a bigger human brain. And of course, that's what he would have created in Piltdown Man, exactly what scientists wanted. And if he was responsible for this, it wasn't his only forgery. At least 38 of Dawson's discoveries were fakes, including the stone axe, Roman statuette, and the teeth of Plagiaulex Dawsoni, which I'm still probably mispronouncing. But why would Dawson fake all of these discoveries, including Piltdown Man? Like we've already discussed, the entire scientific community was desperate to find evidence of evolution, and Britain was behind in the competition. In 1909, in a letter to Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, Dawson said he was waiting for the big find, which never seemed to come along. The Piltdown Man discovery brought him a lot of notoriety, and I think that's what he wanted all along. In 2009, a paleoanthropologist named Dr. Isabelle de Groot began a years-long study. She and her team looked at Piltdown Man a bit harder to see if they could find out who perpetrated the hoax. The team included historians, DNA experts, dental experts, and paleobiologists. Dr. de Groot and her team did DNA tests on the jaw that had already been found to be from an orangutan. They determined they were all from the same orangutan, and they speculated that whoever did this got the bones from a curiosities shop. They weren't able to extract any DNA from the human skull or do any sort of carbon dating on it because it had degraded too much. But they did find a few more interesting things. They discovered that cracks and gaps in the bones had been filled with putty and gravel. The gravel had supposedly been added to make it look like the bones had been sitting in the gravel pit for a while. The putty had been used to reform the jaw and put the teeth back in after breaking it and reforming it to make it look more authentic. The team also found out more about the actual bones. Dr. Oakley believed in the 1950s that the orangutan bones came from a female juvenile orangutan. Dr. de Groot and her colleagues believed this orangutan came from Borneo, an island in the South Pacific. They also concluded that the skull fragments came from 2 or 3 medieval humans. Dr. de Groot said there was a fingerprint throughout all of these specimens. Because of the consistency of technique, she believed one person was behind the whole thing. She also noted that bones from the same orangutan were used in Piltdown and Piltdown 2. And remember, Charles Dawson was the only person who knew where the site that Piltdown 2 had been found was. Due to this, along with all the other evidence, she and her team concluded that the perpetrator was Charles Dawson. She announced her findings in a paper in 2016, though she did say that it wasn't clear if Dawson acted alone or had help. As of 2012, the Piltdown Man skull is in a safe at the Natural History Museum in London. After the study by Dr. de Groot and her team was published in 2016, there hasn't been a lot of major news on the story. But one question remains. Assuming it was Charles Dawson, and I think it's pretty safe to say it was, how did he pull the wool over so many people's eyes for so long? There are a few theories floating around, but I want to talk about 2 in particular that I think both contributed. The first is that scientists in 1912 couldn't study these so-called remains. After the announcement, Piltdown Man's remains were locked up tight, and most scientists never got a chance to study them up close, having to draw conclusions based on a reconstruction. It's difficult to study something without actually, seeing it. Although it does happen quite a bit. The other reason I think this happened is a phrase that you've probably heard floating around on the internet for the past few years: confirmation bias. To scientists in the late 1800s and early 1900s, evolution made perfect sense to them as a theory, and like we've already discussed, they were desperate to find evidence or proof of it. It's not hard to see how they could have wanted the Piltdown Man to be real, so much that they ignored all evidence to the contrary. Remember, there were skeptics early on, but they were usually ignored or dismissed. So I don't think it's going to come as a shock that creationists frequently bring up the Piltdown Man hoax as a fraud of evolution. There are plenty of websites discussing or focused on creationism that talk about the discovery and subsequent exposure of the hoax. From what I gather just reading through them, it seems like they're mostly focused on the confirmation bias and how scientists were duped by the hoax because they so desperately wanted to prove evolution. So a few more things I want to mention before we go. There are some books on the subject. Some of the most well-known ones are The Piltdown Man Hoax, Case Closed, and The Piltdown Papers. I will leave links for those below if you want to check them out. There also used to be a band called Piltdown Men. According to Last.fm, this rock and roll instrumental group was active in the early 1960s and actually got their name from the Piltdown Man hoax. Some of their songs include McDonald's Cave and Brontosaurus Stomp, and their music sounds very much like the rock music of that era. I will leave a link below to a playlist with some of those songs on it if you want to check that out as well. So that's just about all I have for you today on the Piltdown Man hoax, and as always, I would love to know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and share it, and for more dark content, darker than this, I hope you'll consider subscribing and hitting the bell. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.